The B-17 Flying Fortress that crashed on a training flight outside Rapid City, South Dakota, in January 1943, burned for 14 minutes before the fire crews reached it. By then, there was little left to examine except twisted aluminum and 4 bodies. The official report attributed the crash to pilot error during a steep banking maneuver in sub-zero conditions. The case was closed within a week. 3 weeks later, another B-17 went down during a night training exercise near Great Falls, Montana. The bomber had been executing routine turns when it suddenly lost electrical power. The pilot managed to radio a distress call before the aircraft entered an uncontrolled descent. All 9 crew members died on impact. In the basement offices of the Army Air Force's Materiel Command at Wright Field, Ohio, a procurement officer named Captain Douglas Henning noticed that both aircraft had come from the same production batch at Boeing's Seattle plant. He requested the maintenance logs. What he found made him reach for the telephone. By March, 7 B-17s had been lost in stateside training accidents. 5 of them shared the same symptoms: sudden electrical failure followed by loss of control. The bombers were falling from American skies before they ever reached combat. The war demanded 4-engine bombers in quantities that would have seemed impossible 3 years earlier. Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed ran assembly lines 24 hours a day. Every aircraft that burned on a training field was an aircraft that would never reach England, never drop bombs on German factories, never protect the crews of 100 other planes. The mathematics were brutal. America needed to deliver 1 new heavy bomber every 63 minutes just to maintain the planned bombing campaign against Germany. But somewhere in the intricate web of wiring, generators, motors, and instruments that transformed aluminum and steel into a flying fortress, something was failing. The problem was not obvious. Each B-17 contained 11 miles of electrical wiring, hundreds of circuits connecting radio equipment, navigation instruments, gun turrets, bomb release mechanisms, heating systems, and hydraulic pumps. The electrical system was the nervous system of the aircraft. Without it, the bomber was simply a very expensive glider. Engineers at Wright Field began a systematic investigation. They examined wiring diagrams, tested voltage regulators, inspected generator output, and checked solder joints under microscopes. They found nothing definitively wrong. The components met specifications. The assembly procedures were correct. The quality control inspections had been passed. Yet the failures continued. In April, a technical conference was convened at Wright Field. 32 engineers, procurement officers, and Boeing representatives spent 3 days reviewing every aspect of the electrical system. They generated a report with 14 recommendations, mostly involving additional inspections and minor specification changes. The Army Air Forces implemented all of them. The crashes continued. The pattern was maddeningly inconsistent. Most B-17s performed flawlessly, but approximately 1 in every 180 aircraft would experience catastrophic electrical failure, usually during maneuvers in cold weather, usually without warning. The failure rate was small enough that it might be attributed to random chance or inevitable wartime production defects, but large enough that it was killing American air crews at a rate of 1 per week. By June 1943, the problem had been escalated to the highest levels of the Materiel Command. A team of electrical engineers from General Electric and Westinghouse was brought in to consult. They proposed several theories: voltage spikes from the generators, inadequate grounding, moisture infiltration, vibration fatigue in wire connections. Each theory led to modifications. Each modification failed to stop the crashes. The real problem was hiding in plain sight, in a component so mundane that nobody had thought to examine it carefully: the ceramic insulators. The Midland Ceramics Company occupied a 3-story brick building in Canton, Ohio, that had once manufactured porcelain bathroom fixtures. In 1942, the Army Air Forces had contracted with Midland to produce high-voltage ceramic insulators for aircraft electrical systems. These insulators were small, cylindrical components, each about the size of a man's thumb, made from a specialized porcelain compound that could withstand the heat and voltage of aircraft electrical systems. The insulators seemed trivial. They were not glamorous components like turbochargers or bomb sights. They did not move or compute or transmit. They simply sat at junction points in the wiring harness, preventing electrical current from grounding through the aircraft's aluminum structure. Each B-17 contained approximately 300 of them. Midland Ceramics ran 3 shifts. The night shift, which operated from midnight to 8 in the morning, was staffed largely by workers who could not find positions on the day shifts. Older men, workers with physical limitations, and immigrants whose English was imperfect. Among these workers was a man named Alexander Volkov. Alexander Volkov was 53 years old in the summer of 1943. He had been born in Kiev, in what was then the Russian Empire, and had trained as a master ceramicist in the workshops of the Imperial Porcelain Factory in St. Petersburg. He had emigrated to America in 1921, part of the flood of refugees fleeing the collapse of the Russian Civil War. He spoke English with a thick accent. His paperwork identified him as Alexander Volkov, which is what his coworkers called him, though he continued to think of himself by his Russian name. For 20 years, Volkov had worked in ceramic studios and small factories across the Midwest, Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago, Toledo, making decorative porcelain, industrial crucibles, and electrical components. He was a skilled craftsman, capable of working with the ancient chemistry of clay, feldspar, and kaolin to produce ceramics with precise thermal and electrical properties. But he had no engineering degree, no formal credentials that American companies recognized. He was simply a factory worker. At Midland Ceramics, Volkov operated one of the kilns, where the insulators were fired at temperatures exceeding 1,400 degrees Celsius. The process required careful attention. Too little heat and the porcelain would remain porous and weak. Too much heat and it would deform or crack. Volkov worked alone during the night shift, tending 3 kilns simultaneously, adjusting gas flows and monitoring temperatures with an intuition developed over 3 decades of work. He noticed the problem in late May. The insulators that emerged from Volkov's kilns looked perfect. They were smooth, white, precisely formed. They passed all inspections. Under magnification, their surfaces showed no cracks or voids. Their electrical resistance tested within specification. They were boxed and shipped to Boeing's Seattle plant, where they were installed in the wiring harnesses of B-17 bombers. But Volkov had begun to notice something about the insulators produced during certain weather conditions. Canton, Ohio, experiences dramatic humidity fluctuations. Summer days can be oppressively humid, with moisture levels above 80%. The nights, especially after midnight, often cool rapidly, causing the humidity to drop. Volkov noticed that on nights when the humidity fell below 30%, which happened perhaps once or twice a week, the insulators emerging from the kilns had a slightly different surface quality. The difference was barely perceptible, a faint graininess, visible only at certain angles under bright light. The insulators still passed inspection. The dimensional tolerances were correct. The electrical resistance was within specification. But Volkov knew ceramics. He had spent his professional life understanding how materials respond to thermal stress and environmental conditions. He knew that porcelain is not truly a single material, but a complex matrix of crystals and glass, and that its properties depend on precise control of the firing process. He knew that moisture in the air affects how raw ceramic compounds behave during firing, and that rapid drying can create internal stresses that are invisible but real. He suspected that the insulators fired on low humidity nights contained microscopic flaws, not cracks exactly, but regions of stress, where the crystalline structure of the porcelain was slightly disorganized. Under normal conditions, these flaws would be irrelevant. But under the extreme conditions of high-altitude flight, where temperatures could drop to 40 degrees below zero and then rise rapidly, where vibration was constant, where voltage fluctuations were common, these stressed regions might fail. Volkov mentioned his concern to the night shift supervisor in early June. The supervisor, a man named Bill Kovach, who had been promoted to his position after 15 years of competent but unimaginative work, listened politely and thanked Volkov for his diligence. Kovacs noted the concern in a logbook and did nothing else. The insulators were passing inspection. Production quotas were being met. The Army Air Forces had not issued any complaints. Changing the production process based on the subjective observation of a kiln operator, especially an immigrant kiln operator with no engineering credentials, would require stopping the line, filing reports, and justifying the delay to anxious procurement officers. Kovacs saw no reason to create problems where none officially existed. Volkov returned to his work. By July 1943, the crash investigation had taken on a desperate quality. 16 B-17s had now been lost to electrical failure. The statistical probability that this was random chance had dropped to less than 1%. Something was systematically wrong. The investigation team, now led by a colonel named Raymond Foster, who reported directly to the commanding general of the Material Command, began to examine not just the bombers, but the entire supply chain. They visited subcontractors, reviewed procurement records, and audited quality control procedures at dozens of facilities. In late July, an inspection team visited Midland Ceramics. The team consisted of 3 men, an Army captain named Steinberg, who specialized in procurement logistics, an electrical engineer from Westinghouse named Dr. Paul Morrison, and a quality control inspector named Vincent Corelli. They spent 6 hours at the Midland plant, reviewing production records, examining samples of insulators, and observing the manufacturing process. They found nothing wrong. The insulators met specifications. The kilns were operating at correct temperatures. The quality control procedures were being followed. The inspection team wrote a brief report noting that Midland Ceramics was in full compliance with contract requirements and moved on to the next subcontractor on their list. Volkov was working the night shift when the inspection team visited, so they never spoke to him. In August, another B-17 went down near Boise, Idaho. The crash investigators recovered enough of the aircraft to perform a detailed examination. Among the wreckage, they found several ceramic insulators that had fractured in a distinctive pattern, radial cracks emanating from a central point, consistent with thermal shock or internal stress failure. Colonel Foster ordered a metallurgical analysis of insulators from 10 crashed aircraft. The results were puzzling. The insulators showed no obvious defects, but microscopic examination revealed subtle variations in crystalline structure. Some regions of the porcelain showed tighter crystal alignment than others. The variations were small, barely measurable, but they suggested that the manufacturing process was not as consistent as the specifications implied. Foster ordered a new inspection of all subcontractors producing ceramic components. This time, the inspection team was more thorough. The second inspection team arrived at Midland Ceramics on a Tuesday in mid-September, without advance notice. They came at 6 in the evening and stayed for 14 hours, observing all 3 shifts. By 2 in the morning, they were in the kiln room with Alexander Volkov. The lead inspector was a materials engineer named Captain James Holt, who had worked in the ceramics industry before the war. Holt knew what questions to ask. He examined the kilns, reviewed the firing schedules, and studied the raw materials. He asked Volkov about the process. Volkov, working through the night with his usual quiet competence, explained the firing cycle, the temperature gradients, the cooling rates. His English was heavily accented but precise. Holt listened. Then Holt asked, quote, 0. Volkov hesitated. He remembered his conversation with Supervisor Kovacs 3 months earlier. He remembered that nothing had changed. He was 53 years old, an immigrant, a kiln operator without credentials. He had no reason to believe that this new inspector would listen any differently than the previous ones. But men were dying. Volkov explained his observation about low humidity nights. He described the subtle surface quality differences he had noticed. He explained his theory about internal stresses in the ceramic matrix. Holt asked to see samples. Holt returned to right field with 30 insulators, 15 that Volkov had identified as being fired on low humidity nights, and 15 that had been fired under normal conditions. He delivered them to the materials laboratory with instructions to perform destructive testing under conditions simulating high-altitude flight. The laboratory subjected the insulators to thermal cycling, repeated exposure to temperature swings from plus 50 degrees Celsius to minus 40 degrees Celsius, while simultaneously applying mechanical vibration at frequencies corresponding to aircraft engine resonance. They measured electrical resistance continuously. After 300 cycles, equivalent to approximately 40 hours of flight time, 12 of the 15 insulators from low-humidity production batches showed measurable increases in electrical resistance. After 500 cycles, 7 had failed completely, fracturing internally in a manner that would cause catastrophic electrical grounding. The insulators fired under normal humidity conditions showed no failures. Holt wrote a 16-page report. The core finding was technical but clear. When ceramic slurry with inadequate moisture content is fired, it undergoes more rapid dehydration during the heating phase, which creates microregions of differential crystal growth. These regions become stress concentration points. Under repeated thermal and mechanical stress, these points propagate into fractures. The solution was equally clear. Maintain humidity above 40% in the production facility during all stages of manufacture, and extend the drying time for raw ceramic blanks before firing. The problem was that implementing this solution would require acknowledging that the current production process was flawed, halting production at Midland Ceramics for modifications, and recalling potentially defective insulators from the supply chain. It would delay bomber production. It would require difficult conversations with Boeing and other aircraft manufacturers. It would mean admitting that the Army Air Forces had been installing defective components in combat aircraft for more than a year. Colonel Foster read Holt's report in early October. He understood the implications immediately. He also understood that the investigation had cost the Army Air Forces 6 months and 17 aircraft. The bombing campaign against Germany was intensifying. The 8th Air Force needed every aircraft it could get. Foster took the report to his commanding officer, Brigadier General Kenneth Wolfe, who commanded the Material Command's Engineering Division. They met in Wolfe's office on a gray afternoon, rain streaking the windows. Wolfe read the report in silence. Then he said, "You're telling me that a kiln operator spotted this before our engineers did?" "Yes, sir." "A Russian immigrant kiln operator?" "Yes, sir." Wolfe set the report on his desk. "If we implement these changes, how long does production stop?" "Midland estimates 3 weeks to install humidity control equipment and modify procedures. Then, another 2 weeks to work through the backlog of raw materials. 5 weeks total. How many bombers?" Foster had done the calculation. "Approximately 80 aircraft will be delayed." Wolfe stared out the window. 80 aircraft. Against 17 that had already been lost, and perhaps dozens more that would fail in combat. The mathematics were clear. But mathematics were not the only consideration in wartime. "Do it," Wolfe said, and quietly. On October 18, 1943, Midland Ceramics received a contract modification requiring the installation of industrial humidification equipment and revised production procedures. The modification was classified as a process enhancement rather than a correction of defects. No mention was made of the crashes. The work was completed by mid-November. Production resumed with new protocols. Humidity maintained between 45% and 55% in all production areas, extended drying times for ceramic blanks, and additional inspection procedures focusing on surface quality under magnified lighting. Simultaneously, a confidential technical bulletin was issued to all Army Air Forces maintenance depots and aircraft manufacturers, recommending inspection and replacement of ceramic insulators in certain production batches. The bulletin provided specific batch numbers and date codes. The replacement program was described as preventive maintenance rather than an emergency recall. The program was executed with the methodical efficiency that characterized American military logistics. Over 3 months, maintenance crews inspected and selectively replaced insulators in approximately 1,400 B-17s and several hundred other aircraft. The work was done during routine maintenance cycles, without public announcement. Alexander Volkov continued working the night shift at Midland Ceramics. His wages were not increased. His title did not change. He received no commendation. Captain Holt mentioned Volkov's contribution in his report, and Colonel Foster ensured that a brief note was placed in Volkov's personnel file at the factory, stating that he had provided valuable technical observations to an Army Air Force's investigation. That was all. The last B-17 to crash, due to electrical failure, was lost on December 3, 1943, near Sioux Falls, South Dakota. The aircraft had been manufactured before the insulator modifications were implemented. After that date, the pattern ended. The Army Air Forces continued to lose bombers, to mechanical failures, to training accidents, to the inevitable toll of pushing complex machines and young crews to their limits. But the specific pattern of sudden electrical failure disappeared. By early 1944, the investigation was closed. The final report, classified confidential, was filed in the archives at Wright Field. It ran to 247 pages, including technical appendices and laboratory test results. Alexander Volkov was mentioned once, in a footnote on page 83. The broader story was never made public. The War Department saw no benefit in announcing that a production defect had killed 17 aircrews in stateside accidents. The crashes had been officially attributed to various causes: pilot error, mechanical failure, weather conditions. Families had been notified. The case was closed. Boeing and other aircraft manufacturers implemented the modified insulator specifications without public comment. Midland Ceramics continued production. The war continued. On March 6, 1944, a B-17 named Carolina Moon participated in a bombing raid against Berlin. The aircraft was part of the 398th Bombardment Group, flying from a base in England. It was the crew's 9th mission. Over Germany, Carolina Moon was attacked by FW-190 fighters. The bomber took damage to its No. 3 engine and right wing. The pilot, a 23-year-old lieutenant from North Carolina named Thomas Briggs, fought to maintain control while the navigator worked to identify an emergency landing field. The aircraft's electrical system, stressed by battle damage, by the cold at 25,000 feet, by the constant vibration of 3 remaining engines running at maximum power, continued to function. The insulators held. Carolina Moon made it to an emergency field in Belgium. All 9 crew members survived. There were thousands of similar stories, unrecorded and unremembered. Bombers that took damage but made it home. Electrical systems that continued working under conditions that should have caused failure. Crews who survived because a component deep in the aircraft's wiring harness, a small ceramic cylinder that they would never see and whose purpose they would never understand, did not crack at the critical moment. The mathematics are impossible to calculate precisely, but reasonable estimates suggest that the insulator modifications may have prevented 50 to 70 additional aircraft losses over the remainder of the war. Between 500 and 700 airmen, who might have died in crashes or been forced to bail out over enemy territory, instead completed their tours and went home. They never knew why. Alexander Volkov worked at Midland Ceramics until the summer of 1945, when the plant converted back to civilian production. He was laid off along with 3/4 of the workforce as the war contracts ended. He found work at a small pottery studio in Cleveland, where he spent his final working years making decorative ceramics for department stores. He retired in 1952 at the age of 62. His pension was modest. Volkov lived quietly in a small apartment in Cleveland's Tremont neighborhood. He never married. He maintained correspondence with a few relatives still in Russia, though this became difficult during the Cold War years. He attended Russian Orthodox services regularly. He read extensively: Russian literature, American newspapers, books on ceramics and chemistry. He died in November 1961 of heart failure at the age of 71. His obituary in the Cleveland Plain Dealer was 4 sentences long. It identified him as a retired ceramics worker, born in Russia, survived by no immediate family. It made no mention of the war years. His possessions were liquidated by the building superintendent. Among his effects was a small wooden box containing papers, his naturalization certificate, his passport, employment records from various factories, a few photographs. There were no medals, no commendations, no letters of appreciation from the Army Air Forces. The box was discarded. In 1987, a historian named Dr. Patricia Hammond was conducting research at the National Archives facility in College Park, Maryland. She was writing a dissertation on industrial mobilization during World War II, focusing on the role of immigrant workers in war production. Hammond was working through procurement records from the Army Air Force's Material Command when she found a reference to the Midland ceramics investigation. The reference was brief, a single line in a monthly summary report, but it included a case number. She requested the full file. The investigation report had been declassified in 1973 as part of a routine review of wartime documents. It had never been requested by a researcher before. Hammond read it over 2 days, taking careful notes. She found Captain Holt's technical report. She found the laboratory test results. She found the modification orders sent to Midland Ceramics. And she found the footnote mentioning Alexander Volkov, kiln operator, who had, quote, 15 Hammond, tried to find more information about Volkov. She contacted the Department of Veterans Affairs, the Social Security Administration, and historical societies in Ohio. She found his naturalization record, his employment history, and his death certificate. She found that he had never served in the military, had never received any official recognition, and had left no surviving family. She included a brief section about Volkov in her dissertation, which was published as a book by a university press in 1991. The book sold approximately 1,200 copies, mostly to libraries and scholars. The section about Volkov was 3 pages long. In a book of 412 pages, a few readers noticed it. Fewer remembered it. The building that housed Midland Ceramics still stands in Canton, Ohio, though the company closed in 1968, unable to compete with larger manufacturers. The building has been repurposed several times, as a warehouse, as an art studio collective, as office space for small businesses. The kilns are gone. The production floor has been subdivided. The night shift rooms where Alexander Volkov worked are now occupied by a commercial printing company and an accounting firm. There is no historical marker. The building is not registered on any historic preservation list. If you drove past it, you would see only a modest 3-story brick structure, industrial architecture from another era, unremarkable. But on cold nights, when the humidity drops and the air is clear, you can stand on the corner where the factory entrance once was and imagine the sound of kilns running through the darkness, tended by men and women whose names have been forgotten, but whose work helped determine the outcome of history. Wars are won by many factors: strategy, resources, leadership, courage, technology, logistics, intelligence. Historians study these factors, analyze them, write about them. We remember the generals and the battles, the decisive moments and the turning points. But wars are also won by things that are harder to measure: the accumulated effect of thousands of small problems solved, of components that worked when they might have failed, of flaws caught before they caused catastrophe. The insulator problem killed 17 aircrews. The modification prevented perhaps 50 more deaths. These numbers are small in the context of a war that killed millions. The story merited a footnote. Nothing more, but consider, 50 aircraft that did not crash meant 50 crews that completed their tours. Those crews flew perhaps 500 additional missions. Those missions contributed to the destruction of German industrial capacity, to the degradation of the Luftwaffe, to the eventual Allied victory in Europe. The effects ripple outward, impossible to trace precisely, but real. And then, consider the men themselves. 500 airmen who came home, who married and raised families, who became teachers and engineers and salesmen and farmers, who lived into the 1980s and 1990s, who told stories to their grandchildren about flying through flak and fighting in the sky above Europe. They did not know that a Ukrainian immigrant kiln operator, working alone in an Ohio factory in the middle of the night, had helped ensure that they would live to tell those stories. This is what history is. Not just the recorded events, the battles and treaties and speeches, but the invisible web of cause and effect, the countless small actions that accumulate into outcomes. Most of these actions are never documented. Most of the people who perform them are never named. Alexander Volkov saved lives, but he did so quietly, in a way that left almost no trace. His contribution was recorded in a footnote that almost no one read. His grave in Cleveland's Riverside Cemetery is marked with a simple stone that gives his name and dates, nothing more. But the bombers flew. The missions continued. The war was won, in part because of insulators that did not crack, problems that were solved, and attention that was paid by people who were never thanked. The archives preserve what they can, but archives are incomplete. The full story of any historical moment is always larger than what can be documented. Between the headlines and the official reports, in the gaps and silences, are the people who did the work and solved the problems and made things function. They are almost never famous. They are rarely remembered. But they were there, and what they did mattered. On a night shift in Canton, Ohio, in the summer of 1943, a man noticed something that others had overlooked. He mentioned it, despite having every reason to believe he would be ignored. And because he did, some number of young men, we will never know exactly how many, came home from the war. That is the story. It is not heroic in the traditional sense. There is no dramatic climax, no moment of glory, no public recognition. But it is true in the way that history is true. Not in the grand narratives we construct afterward, but in the quiet accumulation of details, in the work that was done, and the problems that were solved, and the lives that were saved, by people whose names we have forgotten, but whose contributions remain invisible but real, woven into the fabric of what happened. The building in Canton still stands. The archive in College Park preserves a report. A footnote mentions a name. That is enough. It has to be.